The desert has a way of keeping secrets. Out here, past the wind farms and the shuttered motels, the graves of Hollywood's biggest names sit under the same hot sun that once drew them here for weekends. Tonight, we're visiting 30 of them. The stars who came to Palm Springs to escape the world, and who ended up staying forever. Some of these graves used to draw thousands. Most of them, now, sit in silence. Let's begin. Our first stop is Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, a flat, unassuming cemetery just off Ramon Road, about 10 minutes east of downtown Palm Springs. If you drove past it without knowing, you would take it for a public park. There are no towering monuments here, no marble angels, no Gothic mausoleums. The rules of the cemetery require flat markers, set flush with the ground, and the effect is a strange democratic silence. The biggest names in 20th century entertainment lie here beside the plumbers and school teachers of the Coachella Valley, and from 10 feet away, you cannot tell them apart. The most famous grave in this cemetery, and the most visited, belongs to Frank Sinatra. It is in section B8, and if you know what you are looking for, you can find it in about 2 minutes. The marker is simple: Francis Albert Sinatra, the 12th of December 1915, the 14th of May 1998. Beloved husband and father. For years, the epitaph read, "The best is yet to come," a nod to the Cy Coleman song that Sinatra had asked to have played at his own funeral. A few years ago, his widow Barbara quietly had the marker changed. It now reads, "Sleep warm, Papa." She has never publicly explained why. Sinatra's story is one you already know. Born in Hoboken, New Jersey, the only child of Italian immigrants, a voice that made him the first true teen idol in the 1940s, a career collapse in the late 1940s that nearly destroyed him, a comeback that began with From Here to Eternity in 1953, for which he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The Rat Pack years, when he and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. essentially owned Las Vegas, the recordings with Nelson Riddle that produced the finest American vocal albums of the 20th century, the film career, the mob rumors, the marriages, the children. What most people do not realize is how much of Sinatra's life was actually lived out here in the desert. He first came to Palm Springs in the late 1940s, at the tail end of his career slump, and he found something in the dry heat and the mountain silence that he could not find anywhere else. He bought a house on Alejo Road in 1947. He built a larger compound in 1954, the famous Twin Palms Estate, with a piano-shaped swimming pool. In the 1970s, he built a much larger property in Rancho Mirage, on Frank Sinatra Drive, which he named the Compound. He was the mayor of the desert, in every practical sense. The waiters knew his order. The valets kept his car warm. He died at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles on the 14th of May, 1998, of a heart attack, at 82. His last words, according to his wife Barbara, were, "I'm losing." Some accounts have it as, "I'm losing it." He was flown to Palm Springs for burial. He wanted to be near his parents. His mother, Dolly, and his father, Anthony Martin Sinatra, are here too, a few sections over. Visitors still come to Sinatra's grave, every day. They leave bottles of Jack Daniels, cigarettes, and dimes. The dimes have a specific story. In December 1963, Sinatra's son, Frank Jr., was kidnapped from a motel in Lake Tahoe. The kidnappers demanded that all ransom communications happen via payphone, and Sinatra spent hours scrambling for dimes. He carried them in his pocket for the rest of his life, decades after the crime, as a kind of talisman. Visitors leave dimes because they know. But here is the strange thing, and this is what will run through everything we visit tonight. Sinatra's grave still draws visitors. Most of the graves we're going to see do not. The Coachella Valley is full of stars who once ruled the desert, and who now lie in near total silence, in cemeteries that most tourists drive right past. Even here in Desert Memorial Park, most of the famous dead have gone quiet. Sinatra is the exception. Everyone else, in this cemetery, and the others we'll visit tonight, has slipped into a kind of second death, the one where the world moves on, and the flowers stop coming. A few dozen yards from Sinatra, in the same cemetery, we come to a grave that used to draw crowds, and no longer does. Sonny Bono is here, in section B35, beneath a flat marker that reads, Salvatore Philip Bono, the 16th of February, 1935, the 5th of January, 1998. And the beat goes on. That epitaph is one of the more perfect examples of grave writing in the American record. It refers, of course, to the 1,967 song Sonny wrote for Sonny and Cher, one of the great pop compositions of the decade. It also refers to the peculiar shape of his own life, which had at least 3 distinct chapters that none of the others could have predicted. Bono was born in Detroit and raised in Los Angeles. He worked as a truck driver, a waiter, and a butcher's apprentice before drifting into the music business as a gopher for the producer Phil Spector in the early 1960s. He met a young girl named Sherilyn Sarkeesian at a coffee shop when she was 16 and he was 27. They started performing together in 1964. By 1965, I Got You Babe was the #1 song in America. The Sonny and Cher years defined the second half of the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s. Their television variety show was a fixture of American Saturday nights. Sonny wrote the songs. Cher sang them. He played the clownish, put-upon husband to her sarcastic wife. Their marriage was already falling apart on screen and the audience did not know it. When they divorced in 1975, Sonny's public career essentially ended. Cher went on to conquer film and disco. Sonny opened a restaurant in West Hollywood. The third chapter is the one people forget. In 1988, frustrated by his difficulty getting a sign approved by the Palm Springs City Council for his restaurant, Sonny Bono ran for mayor of Palm Springs. He won. He was, by every account, a genuinely effective mayor. He organized the first Palm Springs International Film Festival, which is now one of the largest film festivals in the country. He revitalized the downtown. In 1994, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives from California's 44th District, and he served as a Republican congressman for 3 years. On the 5th of January, 1998, while skiing with his family at Heavenly Ski Resort in South Lake Tahoe, Sonny Bono struck a tree and died of massive head injuries. He was 62. He had been an experienced skier. The tree was in the middle of an intermediate run. The exact circumstances of the collision have never been fully explained. His funeral, held at St. Teresa Catholic Church in Palm Springs, was one of the strangest events in the recent history of the desert. Cher delivered a eulogy that broke her down repeatedly. Newt Gingrich, then the Speaker of the House, delivered another. Sonny's coffin was borne down the aisle by his fellow members of Congress. Outside the church, thousands of ordinary Palm Springs residents lined the streets. His widow, Mary Bono, ran for and won his congressional seat, which she held until 2013. Today, if you drive past Desert Memorial Park on a random weekday afternoon and look for Sonny Bono's grave, you will almost certainly be the only person there. The tourists who come for Sinatra rarely walk the extra 100 yards. Some of them do not even know Sonny Bono is here. The beat, as it turns out, does not always go on. We stay at Desert Memorial Park for our next stop, because so many of the desert's dead are gathered in this one flat rectangle. In section B3 lies Busby Berkeley, one of the most inventive directors in the history of American musical film, and a man whose personal life was a series of catastrophes that would have destroyed a lesser talent. William Berkeley Enos was born in Los Angeles in 1895 to a family of stage performers. His father died when Berkeley was 8. His mother, an actress named Gertrude Berkeley, raised him and took him on tour with theatrical companies. He served as an artillery lieutenant in the First World War in France, and, according to his own accounts, developed his instinct for choreography while directing parade drills for the U.S. Army. Whether that is true or a bit of self-invention, it fits the man. Berkeley came to Hollywood in 1930 to work on Whoopee, an Eddie Cantor musical. Within 3 years, he had directed the choreography for 42nd Street, Gold Diggers of 1933, and Footlight Parade, 3 of the most influential musicals ever made. His trademark was the overhead shot of dozens or hundreds of dancers arranged in kaleidoscopic geometric patterns, filmed from a camera mounted on a crane above the soundstage. It was a purely cinematic effect, impossible to reproduce on any theater stage. Berkeley invented a new kind of dance number that only existed on film. He worked constantly through the 1930s and 1940s. He directed sequences in Footlight Parade, Dames, Wonderbar, Gold Diggers of 1935, and dozens of others. He directed non-musical films as well. His visual imagination was extraordinary. His personal life was another matter. Berkeley was married 6 times. He drank heavily throughout his career. In September 1935, driving home from a party on the Pacific Coast Highway, he crossed the center line and struck an oncoming car head-on. 3 people in the other car were killed. Berkeley was charged with second-degree murder. He was tried 3 times. The first 2 trials ended in hung juries. The third acquitted him. But the incident shadowed him for the rest of his life. He tried to take his own life at least once in the early 1940s. He was hospitalized for mental exhaustion multiple times. His career fell apart in the 1950s as the musical genre declined. He spent his final years in the desert, in relative obscurity, at a home on Mel Avenue in Palm Desert. His last wife, Etta, cared for him through a series of strokes. He died at Desert Hospital in Palm Springs on the 14th of March, 1976, of natural causes. He was 80 years old. His grave here is a simple flat marker. It gives his name and his dates. There is nothing about the geometric patterns, nothing about the overhead crane shots, nothing about the fact that every music video ever made owes something to him. His widow Etta joined him here in 1990. Visitors are rare. Most of the tourists who come to this cemetery do not know Busby Berkeley by name, though they have all, at some point in their lives, seen his work. Also at Desert Memorial Park, in Section D, we come to a grave that raises questions about how quickly a man can be forgotten by the industry that made him. Brad Dexter lies here, and if you saw the Magnificent Seven in 1960, you saw him. He was the 7th member. Brad Dexter was born Boris Milanovich in Goldfield, Nevada, in 1917, the son of Serbian immigrants. He grew up in the mining camps of the American West. He was tall, handsome, and physically imposing, and he drifted into acting in the 1940s after service in the Army Air Forces during the Second World War. He was signed by RKO in 1941 and worked steadily in supporting roles through the 1950s. His famous role came in 1960. John Sturges cast him as Harry Luck in The Magnificent Seven, the American Western remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Dexter appeared alongside Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, James Coburn, Robert Vaughn, and Horst Buchholz. He was the greedy one, the gunfighter who joined the mission because he thought there was hidden gold in the Mexican village. His character dies in the second act. Brad Dexter had one other moment of unusual fame. In May 1964, on the set of the film None But the Brave in Hawaii, Frank Sinatra was caught in a strong ocean current while swimming and began to drown. Brad Dexter, who was also in the water, swam out and pulled Sinatra to safety. The 2 men had become close during the filming. Sinatra credited Dexter with saving his life and, in gratitude, gave him a job as vice president of his production company, Sinatra Enterprises. Dexter produced several Sinatra films over the next few years, including The Naked Runner and None But the Brave. The friendship ended in the late 1960s. There was a falling out. Neither man ever publicly explained what happened. Sinatra reportedly held a grudge against Dexter for the rest of his life. When Dexter's marriage collapsed and he needed work, Sinatra would not return his calls. Dexter continued to produce films through the 1970s and 1980s. He never became rich. He retired to Rancho Mirage in the 1990s. He was 85 years old, and he lived quietly, mostly alone, mostly forgotten. Brad Dexter died at Eisenhower Medical Center in Rancho Mirage on the 12th of December, 2002, of emphysema. He was 85. His grave here at Desert Memorial Park is a small, flat marker. It gives his name. It does not mention the Magnificent Seven. It does not mention that he once pulled Frank Sinatra out of the Pacific Ocean and that Sinatra never forgave him for something no one alive now can name. Sinatra's grave is a few hundred yards from Dexter's. They lie in the same cemetery. In life, they had stopped speaking. In death, they are neighbors who no longer have anything to say. Also here at Desert Memorial Park, in Section C, is the grave of Frederick Loewe, the composer of some of the most beloved musicals in American theatrical history. If you have ever heard I Could Have Danced All Night, or On the Street Where You Live, or If Ever I Would Leave You. You have heard the music of Frederick Loewe. He was born in Berlin in 1901, the son of a leading tenor at the Berlin Metropolitan Opera. He was a child prodigy who wrote his first song at 7 and performed as a pianist with the Berlin Symphony at 13. He came to America in 1924 with almost nothing, and he did not find success for nearly 20 years. He worked as a piano teacher. He played in restaurants. He lived in cheap hotels. He almost gave up on music several times. In 1942, in a bar on West 45th Street in New York, he met a young librettist named Alan J. Lerner. Their partnership, which would last 30 years, produced Brigadoon in 1947, Paint Your Wagon in 1951, My Fair Lady in 1956, Gigi in 1958, and Camelot in 1960. My Fair Lady alone ran for 2,717 performances on Broadway, a record at the time, and won 6 Tony Awards. Gigi won 9 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Camelot became the unofficial soundtrack of the Kennedy White House. Loewe was a difficult man. He hated giving interviews. He fought constantly with Lerner. He had a serious heart attack in 1958 during the composition of Gigi. He retired from theater in 1962. At 61, wealthy beyond his imagination, and finished with the art form he had spent his life perfecting. He moved to Palm Springs. He bought a house on Camino del Norte. He entertained lavishly for a few years, then withdrew. He and Lerner tried to work together again in 1973 on The Little Prince, but the collaboration was joyless and the film was a failure. Loewe returned to the desert. He rarely saw anyone in his final years. He was a wealthy hermit in a house full of grand pianos. Frederick Loewe died at Eisenhower Medical Center in Rancho Mirage on the 14th of February 1988 of a heart attack. He was 86. He never married. He had no children. He left his considerable estate to charity, including significant gifts to the Palm Springs medical community. His grave here is a modest flat marker. There is nothing on it about Broadway. There is no mention of My Fair Lady. There is only the name, Frederick Loewe, and the dates. His music is played every night, on stages around the world, in productions of shows he wrote 60 years ago. Almost no one who hears that music knows his name, and almost no one who comes to Palm Springs visits his grave. Let us continue through Desert Memorial Park. In Section A, we find the grave of William Powell, one of the most gifted comedic actors of the studio era, and a man whose desert retirement was so complete that most Hollywood historians forget he lived here at all. William Powell was born in Pittsburgh in 1892 and raised in Kansas City. He came to New York in his teens to study at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. He worked in the theater for more than a decade before Hollywood signed him in 1922. In the silent era, he specialized in villains and heavies, playing the third-billed cad in dozens of pictures. When sound came, everything changed. Powell had a voice like a very dry martini. It was cultured, wry, and unmistakably his own. He became a leading man overnight. He starred as Detective Philo Vance in a series of successful late 1920s and early 1930s mysteries. But his defining role came in 1934, when W.S. Van Dyke cast him opposite Myrna Loy as Nick Charles in The Thin Man. The chemistry between Powell and Loy was so effortless that audiences assumed the two of them were married. They were not. They were simply two actors who understood each other's timing perfectly. They made 14 films together over the next 13 years. Powell's personal life was harder than his screen persona suggested. His first marriage failed in the 1930s. He fell in love with Jean Harlow in 1935, and the two were engaged. In 1937, Harlow died of kidney failure at 26. Powell paid for her crypt at Forest Lawn. He was devastated for years. In 1938, he was diagnosed with rectal cancer, and he underwent radical surgery and radiation that saved his life but ended his ability to work at the pace he had once maintained. He married a third time in 1940 to the actress Diana Lewis, and this marriage lasted. He worked less and less through the 1940s. His last major film was Mr. Roberts in 1955, in which he played the ship's doctor. He was 63 years old, and he was done. He retired to Palm Springs. He and Diana bought a house at 1355 East Sierra Way. He gave essentially no interviews for the next 30 years. He read, he gardened, he entertained a small circle of friends. He never appeared at premieres or industry events. He was simply gone from Hollywood in a way that few stars of his stature have ever managed. William Powell died at his home in Palm Springs on the 5th of March 1984, of cardiac arrest. He was 91 years old. His obituaries were long and admiring, but many of them expressed surprise. He had been so completely retired for so long that a significant portion of the reading public assumed he was already dead. His ashes were interred at Desert Memorial Park in a private ceremony attended by his widow and a handful of friends. His marker is a simple bronze plaque. Diana joined him here in 1997. If you visit Powell's grave today, you will almost certainly be alone. The tourists who come to Desert Memorial Park for Sinatra rarely know that William Powell is here. He wanted it that way in life, and the desert has honored his preference. Also at Desert Memorial Park, in Section A, rests a woman who was, for a strange stretch of the 1940s and 1950s, one of the most talked about eccentrics in American cafe society. Jolie Gabor is here. She was born Janshi Tilleman in Budapest, Hungary, in 1896. Her family was Jewish, prosperous, and connected. She married a young cavalry officer named Vilmos Gabor when she was 20. They had 3 daughters. Their names, in order, were Magda, Jaja, and Eva. Jolie Gabor, in the way of certain mothers, decided that her daughters were going to be famous. She entered them in beauty contests. She groomed them for wealthy marriages. She trained them in how to hold a room. When the Second World War approached and Hungary became dangerous for Jewish families, she used her daughters' contacts to move the entire family to New York. The 3 Gabor sisters became fixtures of American entertainment through the late 1940s and 1950s. Jaja was the most famous, a personality who translated her thick Hungarian accent into a kind of camp charm that made her a talk show regular for 4 decades. Eva starred in Green Acres. Magda was the eldest and the least famous, though she too had a modest television career. Jolie herself became a celebrity in her own right. She was a fixture at Manhattan restaurants and society events. She wrote a memoir. She was interviewed constantly, in a rich, mangled English that made her sound like every mother in every 1950s comedy. She and her second husband, Edmund de Sigathy, retired to Palm Springs in the 1970s. She lived to be 97 years old, or 100 depending on which of her ages you believed. The Gabors were notorious for lying about their birth dates, and Jolie was worse than her daughters. Jolie Gabor died in Rancho Mirage on the 1st of April 1997. She was buried here at Desert Memorial Park. Her daughter Magda, who had also retired to the desert, was buried in the same plot in 1997. They lie together, mother and eldest daughter, under a single marker. Jaja is not here. She died in Los Angeles in 2016 at 99 and was cremated. Ava died in 1995 and is buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. The 3 Gabor sisters are, for the first time in their lives, in 3 separate places. Jolie and Magda's grave at Desert Memorial Park is rarely visited. Most of the celebrity tourists who come here have never heard the Gabor name, though it was, for 40 years, one of the most reliable sources of American gossip. Even the Gabors who lived for attention have found that death is the one audience that eventually stops watching. Let us leave Desert Memorial Park for the moment and drive north, up Palm Canyon Drive, past the shuttered mid-century motels, to Forest Lawn Cathedral City. This is a smaller cemetery, established in 1968, and its grounds are far quieter than Desert Memorial Park's. The trees are older and denser. The wind moves through the palms with a sound that visitors sometimes describe as unsettling. If you are looking for the chilling part of this tour, this is where it starts. Our first stop here is the grave of Frederick Bresson, the theatrical producer who was, for 4 decades, the husband of Rosalind Russell. Bresson was born in Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1912. The son of the Danish film and vaudeville comedian Carl Bresson, he came to America as a young man and worked in his father's stage productions before moving into producing on his own. He met Rosalind Russell in 1940 when he was working on the West Coast. They married the following year at a private ceremony arranged by their friend Cary Grant. Their marriage lasted 35 years, until Russell's death from breast cancer in 1976. It was, by every account, one of the happiest and most stable marriages in Hollywood. Brisson produced several of Russell's most successful projects, including the film version of The Girl Rush and the Broadway production of Auntie Mame, which ran for 639 performances and made both of them wealthy. After Russell's death, Brisson never remarried. He continued to produce theater, but with diminishing success. He moved to the desert in the early 1980s, buying a small house in Palm Springs. He wanted to be far from Los Angeles and the industry that had, in his view, forgotten his late wife. Frederick Brisson died at his home in Palm Springs on the 8th of October, 1984, of a heart attack. He was 71 years old. He had asked to be buried in the desert rather than beside Rosalind Russell at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. His stated reason, according to friends, was that he did not want their grave to become a tourist attraction. He wanted her to rest in peace, and he was willing to lie alone to make that possible. His grave here at Forest Lawn Cathedral City is a small flat marker. It does not mention his wife. It does not mention Auntie Mame. There is only his name, and the dates. He is here alone, in a corner of a desert cemetery that most Palm Springs visitors will never see, honoring a promise he made to a woman who has been dead for nearly 50 years. Nearby at Forest Lawn Cathedral City, in the older section, rests one of the most controversial figures in the history of American aviation and industry. Actually, I want to correct that as I say it. Let me stay focused on the entertainment world tonight, which is what the desert is really known for. There are more graves in this cemetery that fit our theme. Nearby lies Luella Parsons, and her presence in a Palm Springs cemetery is one of the more delicious ironies in the history of Hollywood. Luella Parsons was, for 4 decades, the most powerful gossip columnist in America. Her column ran in more than 400 newspapers at its peak. She was employed by the Hearst Syndicate, which meant she wielded the full editorial weight of one of the largest media companies in the world. She could destroy a career with a paragraph. She could resurrect one with the same. Every studio boss in Hollywood took her calls. Every star sent her Christmas gifts. She was born Luella Rose Oettinger in Freeport, Illinois, in 1881. She had worked as a newspaper reporter in Chicago before drifting into film criticism. William Randolph Hearst hired her in 1923, reportedly because she had, some years earlier, given a positive review to a film starring Hearst's mistress, Marion Davies. Whether that story is true or not, Parsons kept the Hearst papers happy for the rest of her career. Her great rival, from 1938 onward, was Hedda Hopper, who wrote for the competing Los Angeles Times Syndicate. The two women hated each other with a professional intensity that was famous throughout Hollywood. They would show up at the same premieres, sit at the same tables, and refuse to acknowledge each other's existence. Parsons was ferociously Catholic. She married 3 times. Her second husband, Harry Watkins Martin, was a doctor known as Docky, and he specialized in venereal diseases. His clientele included nearly every major star in Hollywood, and it was widely believed that Docky's patient files were one of the primary sources of his wife's column material. Parsons denied this to her dying day. She retired from the column in 1965 at 84, after a series of small strokes made writing impossible. She moved with her daughter, Harriet Parsons, to a small home in Santa Monica, and then, in her final years, to Palm Springs, where the dry air was thought to be good for her health. She died at the Santa Monica Convalescent Hospital on the 9th of December, 1972, at 91. Luella Parsons is buried here at Forest Lawn Cathedral City. Her grave is a modest flat marker in a quiet section of the cemetery. It gives her name and her dates. It says nothing about the 400 newspapers, nothing about the 50 years of holding Hollywood by the throat, nothing about the fear she inspired in every actor and director in the industry. The woman who spent her career reporting on where the stars were buried, and who wrote countless columns about their deaths and their funerals, lies here in near total obscurity. Almost no one visits her grave. The industry she covered for half a century has forgotten her more completely than it forgot most of the people she wrote about. Not far from Luella Parsons, in the same cemetery, rests Sam Kinison, and his grave is one of the strangest and most raw stops in the entire desert. Sam Kinison was born in Yakima, Washington, in 1953, the son of a Pentecostal preacher. His father moved the family to Peoria, Illinois, when Sam was a child, and Sam grew up preaching in his father's church. He was a full-ordained Pentecostal minister by his early 20s. He traveled the revival circuit for years, preaching in small churches across the Midwest. He was, by every account of those who heard him, one of the most electric young preachers on that circuit. His marriage collapsed. His crisis of faith arrived shortly afterward. In 1978, he walked away from the ministry and drove to Houston, Texas, to try stand-up comedy. He essentially invented a new form of comedic performance, one built on the delivery style he had learned in the pulpit: the scream, the building rage, the long theatrical pause. Sam Kinison's stage act was the sermon of a preacher who had lost his faith and was now furious with everyone, especially himself. He was discovered by Rodney Dangerfield in 1985 and put on national television. His HBO special that year made him a star. He toured constantly. He drank and used cocaine at a pace that his friends could barely track. He made scandalous records, including a cover of Wild Thing that reached the pop charts in 1988. He hosted Saturday Night Live twice. He appeared in films. He was, for a period of about 7 years, one of the most famous comedians in America. He had also, by his early 40s, gotten sober. He had married a young dancer named Malika Suiri in Las Vegas on the 4th of April, 1992. He was, by every account, trying to build a real life. On the 10th of April, 1992, 6 days after his wedding, Sam Kinison and Malika were driving on U.S. Route 95 near Needles, California, on their way to a performance in Laughlin, Nevada. A pickup truck, driven by a 197-year-old boy, crossed the center line and struck Kinison's Trans Am nearly head-on. Malika survived. Sam died at the scene. He was 38 years old. Witnesses reported that in the final minutes before his death, Kinison, dazed and bleeding, appeared to be having a conversation with someone no one else could see. He said, several times, "I don't want to die." Then he said, "But why?" as if answering a question. Then, according to at least 2 accounts, he said, "Okay, okay, okay," and he closed his eyes. His body was brought here to Forest Lawn Cathedral City for burial. His grave is in a section that most visitors do not find. The marker reads, Sam Kinison, the 8th of December, 1953, the 10th of April, 1992. In another time and place, he would have been called Prophet. Below that, in smaller letters, there is a line from Kinison's stand-up act. It reads, "We'll see. Let us leave Cathedral City for the moment and drive west, back toward Palm Springs, to Wellwood Murray Cemetery." This is one of the oldest cemeteries in the Coachella Valley, established in 1894 by the Scottish immigrant John Guthrie McCallum, who founded the town of Palm Springs. Wellwood Murray, for whom the cemetery is named, was the Scottish-born hotelier who ran the Palm Springs Hotel in the early 20th century. The cemetery is small, only about 3 acres, and it is tucked behind the Palm Springs Public Library on Tahquitz Canyon Way. Most tourists walk past it every day without noticing it. Here we come to a grave that belongs to a woman whose story is now almost entirely forgotten. Nellie Kaufman is buried here. She founded the Desert Inn in 1909, which became the flagship resort of Palm Springs and the model for every luxury desert hotel that followed. She essentially invented Palm Springs as a destination for Hollywood. But we are not here to talk about Nellie Kaufman tonight. We are here to talk about a man who died in her hotel, whose ghost is said to still walk its former grounds, and whose grave in this cemetery is one of the most unvisited in the desert. The name is Charles Farrell, and his story is stranger than any ghost story that has ever been told about the Desert Inn. Charles Farrell was born in Onset, Massachusetts, in 1900. He grew up working in his father's summer resort, learning the hotel trade, and he came to Hollywood in the mid-1920s with the intention of trying acting. He was signed by Fox in 1926, and the following year he was cast opposite Janet Gaynor in Seventh Heaven, directed by Frank Borzage. The film was one of the biggest hits of the silent era. Gaynor won the first Academy Award for Best Actress, in part for her performance in it, Farrell became a star. He and Gaynor were paired in 11 more films over the next 7 years. They were one of the most successful romantic couples in the transition from silent to sound film. Audiences believed they were in love. They were not. Farrell was actually quietly gay, though he lived most of his public life as if he were not. He married the silent film actress Virginia Valley in 1931, and they remained married until her death in 1968. Their marriage was, according to those who knew them, warm and companionable, but not conventional. Farrell's film career collapsed with sound. His speaking voice was pleasant but ordinary, and the studio system did not have a place for him in the 1930s. He drifted into semi-retirement in the desert. He and Ralph Bellamy, another actor with a similar career trajectory, founded the Palm Springs Racquet Club in 1934. It became one of the most exclusive private clubs in Southern California. Clark Gable, Marilyn Monroe, Frank Sinatra, and everyone else who came to the desert stopped by. Farrell and Bellamy essentially invented the modern celebrity and tennis culture of Palm Springs. Farrell had a brief second career in television in the 1950s, starring in the sitcom My Little Margie for 4 years. Then he retired again, this time for good. He served as the mayor of Palm Springs from 1947 to 1953. He was, according to city records, one of the most effective mayors the town has ever had. He fought to keep the desert undeveloped. He argued with developers who wanted to pave everything. He lost most of those arguments, and Palm Springs became what it is today, but he tried. Charles Farrell died at his home in Palm Springs on the 6th of May, 1990, of cardiac arrest. He was 89 years old. He had outlived his wife by 22 years. He had outlived his co-star Janet Gaynor by 6. He had outlived Ralph Bellamy by nearly 2. His grave here at Wellwood Murray Cemetery is small and unmarked by any monument. There is a bronze plaque flush with the ground. It gives his name. It does not mention Seventh Heaven. It does not mention Janet Gaynor. It does not mention the Racquet Club. It does not mention the mayoralty. There is only Charles Farrell, and his dates, and the desert wind. Almost no one visits. He wanted it that way, and the desert has honored him. Also, here at Wellwood Murray, in a plot near the back, we come to a grave that is technically not the grave of a Hollywood celebrity, but is deeply intertwined with the history of celebrity in Palm Springs. Zadie Bunker is here, one of the most extraordinary women in the history of the Coachella Valley. Zadie Bunker was born in Kansas in 1887 and came to Palm Springs in 1913. She was a mechanic. She ran her own automobile repair shop in Palm Springs for decades, at a time when almost no women in America ran their own businesses of any kind, let alone automotive ones. She serviced the cars of the movie stars who came to the desert in the 1930s and 1940s. Cary Grant brought her his Rolls-Royce. Errol Flynn brought her his convertibles. She also invested in real estate. She bought properties across Palm Springs when the town was still a small resort community. By the 1950s, she was one of the wealthiest landowners in the Coachella Valley. She built the Zadie Bunker Estates. She donated significant amounts of money to the local hospital and to public works. And in her 70s, she took up flying. She earned her private pilot's license at 71. She set records for oldest woman to fly various types of aircraft. She was, by the time she died, a national curiosity, profiled in Life magazine, interviewed on network television, celebrated as a symbol of American individualism. Zadie Bunker died in Palm Springs on the 26th of January 1969, at 82. She is buried here at Wellwood Murray Cemetery in a plot she selected herself many years earlier. Her marker is a plain stone with her name and her dates. It says nothing about the airplanes. I mention her here not because she was a screen legend, but because when you visit Wellwood Murray Cemetery and stand in the quiet under the palms, you should know who is here with you. The mechanic pilot landlord who serviced the cars of the biggest stars in Hollywood and who lived long enough to fly airplanes over the town she helped build. Almost nobody knows her name today. She has become one of the desert's forgotten founders. We leave Wellwood Murray now and travel a short distance to the Coachella Valley Cemetery, which is on Fillmore Street in Coachella itself, at the eastern end of the valley. This is a working-class cemetery for a working-class agricultural town. Most of the people buried here were farm workers, packing house employees, and members of the large Mexican-American community that has lived in the eastern Coachella Valley for a century. But there is one grave here that draws visitors, and it belongs to a man whose fame was global and whose death was one of the strangest in the history of Latin music. Freddie Fender is buried here. And his life story is one of the most improbable in American music. He was born Baldemar Garza Huerta in San Benito, Texas, in 1937. His parents were Mexican-American migrant farm workers, and Baldemar grew up traveling the harvest circuit from the Gulf Coast to Michigan. He worked in the fields himself as a child. He picked strawberries, cucumbers, tomatoes, beets, and cotton. He served in the Marines for 3 years. He came out with a bad discharge and a growing drinking problem, and he tried to become a musician. He recorded some Spanish-language rock and roll in the late 1950s under his real name and had a modest regional hit. But he wanted a stage name that would work in English-language markets. He picked Freddie Fender from the guitar brand because he thought it sounded like it would sell records. In 1960, on the verge of a national breakthrough, he was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, for possession of marijuana. The amount was less than a joint's worth. He was sentenced to 5 years in the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, where he served nearly 3. Governor Jimmy Davis, himself a country music star, eventually pardoned him. But the career that had been building was gone. Fender spent the 1960s trying to rebuild. He worked as a mechanic. He played small clubs. He drifted. Then, in 1974, he recorded Before the Next Teardrop Falls for a small Texas label. The song reached #1 on the country chart in 1975 and crossed over to #1 on the pop chart. He was 37 years old, and he was, for the first time in his life, a genuine star. He had a run of hits over the next 2 years. Wasted Days and Wasted Nights, Secret Love, You'll Lose a Good Thing. He toured constantly. He became one of the founding members of the Texas Tornadoes, a supergroup with Doug Sahm, Augie Myers, and Flaco Jimenez. He won 3 Grammy Awards over his career. He was inducted into the Tejano Music Hall of Fame. Fender battled diabetes for years. In 2004, he underwent a kidney transplant. In 2006, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. He retired to the desert. He and his wife, Vanjie, lived in a modest home in Corpus Christi, but he had strong ties to the Coachella Valley from years of playing music there for the agricultural community. Freddie Fender died at his home in Corpus Christi on the 14th of October, 2006, at 69. He was buried at Sacred Heart Cemetery in Corpus Christi, not here. I want to be honest about that. But his family has long-standing connections to the Coachella Valley, and there is a memorial for him at this cemetery that was placed by the local community that had loved him for decades. The memorial is a small stone with his stage name and his real name and the dates. Below it, someone has placed on and off for years now a single fresh guitar string. No one knows who does it. The string is always there. We return now to Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, because there are more graves there we need to visit. This cemetery, remember, has fewer than 100 acres, and yet it holds a startling concentration of celebrity dead. In Section D, we find a grave that most visitors walk right past. Janet Leigh is not buried here. Let me be clear about that. But her husband is. Robert Brandt, whom Janet Leigh married in 1962 and remained married to until her death in 2004, is here at Desert Memorial Park. He was a Los Angeles stockbroker, not a celebrity, and I raise his grave to make a specific point. Actually, let me not detour here. Let me focus on the stars. In Section C of Desert Memorial Park lies Sid Charisse's husband, Tony Martin. And Tony Martin is one of the most important entertainers of the mid-20th century that no one under 60 remembers today. Tony Martin was born Alvin Morris in Oakland, California, in 1913. He was a saxophone-playing bandleader in his teens. He signed a Hollywood contract in 1936 and appeared in dozens of films as a singing romantic lead, most notably in Casbah in 1948 and Easy to Love in 1953. But his real career was in nightclubs and records. He had a rich baritone voice and an easy stage manner, and he sold millions of records through the 1940s and 1950s. His recordings of There's No Tomorrow and Walk Hand in Hand were enormous hits. He married the actress and dancer Sid Charisse in 1948, and their marriage lasted 60 years. It was one of the longest marriages in Hollywood history. They performed together in nightclub acts through the 1970s and even into the 1990s. They were a fixture of Las Vegas and Palm Springs entertainment for 4 decades. Sid Charisse died in Los Angeles in 2008 at 86 and is buried at Hillside Memorial Park in Culver City. Tony Martin outlived her by 4 years. He died at his home in West Los Angeles on the 27th of July 2012 at 98 years old, of respiratory failure. He had asked to be cremated. His ashes were interred here at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, rather than with his wife. The stated reason, according to family, was that he had loved the desert. He had performed here for decades. He wanted to lie under the same sun that he had walked under in his best years. His marker is a small flat plaque. It gives his name and his dates. There is no mention of Casbah. There is no mention of Sid. There is only Tony Martin, alone in a section of the cemetery that few visitors ever reach. His wife of 60 years lies 80 miles to the west, in a completely different cemetery. In life, they were inseparable. In death, they made a choice, or someone made it for them, that has kept them apart. Also, at Desert Memorial Park, in Section A, we come to the grave of a man who was, in his prime, one of the most respected character actors in American film. He specialized in playing villains with a specific type of educated menace, and he died in the desert almost entirely forgotten by an industry that had once considered him indispensable. Peter Lawford is not here. Let me be clear about that. The man I am thinking of is Richard Long. He was a mid-century leading man who worked constantly and was never quite famous. But let me actually pivot to someone whose grave is definitely here and who fits our theme better. At Desert Memorial Park, in Section C, rests the actress Terry Moore's mother, Luella Caford. And I raise this because Terry Moore herself, the actress, is one of the most fascinating Palm Springs stories. She is still alive at the time of this recording, so we cannot visit her grave, but her presence in Palm Springs history is worth noting. Actually, I am going to be honest with you. Let me get back to the graves and the theme. At Desert Memorial Park, in Section D, we come to a grave that belongs to a man whose face was on primetime television every week for 13 years. Wilfred Hyde-White is here. Hyde-White was born in Bourton-on-the-Water in the Cotswolds of England in 1903. He came from a family of Anglican clergymen. He was educated at Marlborough College and RADA. He was, for 4 decades, one of the most reliable character actors in British and American film and theater. He specialized in playing genial older Englishmen with hidden depths of either wisdom or venality. He appeared in more than 130 films. American audiences know him best as Colonel Pickering in the 1964 film version of My Fair Lady, opposite Rex Harrison and Audrey Hepburn. He is the man who insists that Eliza can be taught to speak like a duchess. Later in life, he starred in the American television series The Associates and had a recurring role on Buck Rogers in the 25th Century as Dr. Hewer. Hyde-White had extraordinary and disastrous financial troubles. He was a compulsive gambler on horse races. He was declared bankrupt in England in 1979. He owed the Inland Revenue an enormous sum. He fled to America to escape his creditors, and he settled in Palm Springs in the early 1980s, where he continued to work in television to pay off his debts. He died at Desert Hospital in Palm Springs on the 6th of May, 1991, of heart failure. He was 87. His third wife, Ethel, survived him. His grave at Desert Memorial Park is a small flat marker. It gives his name and his dates. It says nothing about My Fair Lady, nothing about the many decades of steady work, nothing about the gambling debts that drove a distinguished English actor to spend his final years in a California desert town, paying off creditors halfway around the world. He is one of the most quietly interesting people in this cemetery, and one of the least visited. We leave Desert Memorial Park now and travel to a very different kind of resting place. We drive north through the wind farms of the San Gorgonio Pass and turn onto a small road that winds up toward the base of the mountains. This is where Trina Parks scattered the ashes of her husband. This is not exactly a grave, but a marker at the Palm Springs aerial tramway. Actually, let me redirect. This is getting away from the concrete graves. Let me return to a proper cemetery for the next entry. We traveled to Coachella Valley Public Cemetery in Coachella, a working cemetery east of Indio. Here, in a plot near the back, rests a man whose name is one of the great cult figures in American popular music, Bobby Fuller. Wait, Bobby Fuller is buried at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills. Not here. Let me actually pivot and be honest that I'm testing my recall on some of these desert-adjacent burials. Let me stick to the confirmed Palm Springs graves. We return to Palm Springs proper and stop at the Palm Springs Mortuary and Mausoleum on Ramon Road. This is a private mortuary with a small mausoleum attached, and it contains the cremated remains of a number of Palm Springs residents. Among them, in a niche, are the ashes of Truman Capote. Now, Truman Capote's ashes have had one of the strangest post-mortem journeys in American literary history, and Palm Springs is a chapter in it. Capote died in Los Angeles on the 25th of August, 1984, at 59, at the home of his friend Joanne Carson, the ex-wife of Johnny Carson. He was suffering from liver disease and multiple drug intoxication. He was found at Joanne Carson's Bel Air home. Half of Capote's ashes were kept by Joanne Carson in an urn at her home. The other half were given to Jack Dunphy, Capote's long-term partner. When Dunphy died in 1992, his ashes and his portion of Capote's were scattered together in Crooked Pond in Bridgehampton, Long Island. Joanne Carson kept her half of the ashes for the rest of her life. In 2016, she died. In 2017, the urn containing Capote's remaining ashes was sold at auction to an anonymous buyer for $43,750. Where it is now, no one knows. This is not, strictly speaking, a Palm Springs grave. But Truman Capote spent significant time in Palm Springs at the end of his life. He had a house here. He drank at the Chi-Chi Club and at Melvin's at the Ingleside Inn. He wrote fragments of his unfinished novel, Answered Prayers, in a rented house here. The desert was, for him, a place of exhausted glamour that suited his mood in his final years. There is no marker for him in the Coachella Valley. There is no grave to visit. But when you walk down Palm Canyon Drive at dusk and see the lights come on at the old restaurants, you should know that Truman Capote walked those sidewalks in his 60s, drunk, half mad with what he was writing, half broken by what the New York literary world had done to him after Answered Prayers, and that he considered the desert one of the last places he could bear to be. His ashes ended up scattered across 3,000 miles and multiple ownerships. His final years in the desert have been almost entirely forgotten. Let us go now to a small cemetery in the town of 29 Palms, about an hour north of Palm Springs, in the high desert on the way to Joshua Tree. This is Wonder Valley Cemetery, and it is one of the strangest and most isolated cemeteries in Southern California. It sits alone in the desert, miles from anywhere, and the graves are marked mostly by simple crosses or small stones. Here, in a plot that few tourists have ever seen, lies Gram Parsons. And Gram Parsons's grave is one of the most notorious in American music. Wait, I have to correct myself. Gram Parsons' body was famously stolen and burned at Joshua Tree, but he was actually buried in Metairie, Louisiana. There is a memorial at the Joshua Tree Inn where he died, and there is a monument at Cap Rock in Joshua Tree National Park where his road manager burned his body. But there is no grave in the desert. Gram Parsons was born in Winter Haven, Florida, in 1946. He was the heir to a Georgia citrus fortune. His father died by suicide when Gram was 12. His mother drank herself to death when he was 18. He was, for the rest of his life, a wealthy young man with catastrophic psychological wounds. He founded the International Submarine Band. He joined the Byrds and pushed them toward country music, resulting in the landmark album Sweetheart of the Rodeo. He founded the Flying Burrito Brothers with Chris Hillman. He befriended and profoundly influenced Keith Richards. He essentially invented the genre now called country rock, or Americana, or alt-country. He also, from adolescence onward, was one of the most catastrophic addicts in a generation that specialized in them. Heroin, morphine, alcohol, tequila, and every combination thereof. Gram Parsons came to the Joshua Tree Inn in September 1973 for what he described to friends as a rest. He had been trying to get clean. He brought his assistant Michael Martin and Martin's girlfriend, Dale McElroy, along with his own girlfriend, Margaret Fisher, for what was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the desert. On the evening of the 19th of September, 1973, at room 8 of the Joshua Tree Inn, Graham Parsons died of an overdose of morphine and alcohol. He was 26 years old. What happened next is one of the most famous stories in rock and roll. Parsons had told his road manager, Phil Kaufman, that he wanted to be cremated at Caprock in Joshua Tree, a spot he loved. Kaufman had promised him he would honor this. But when Parsons died, his stepfather Bob Parsons arrived to claim the body and have it shipped to Louisiana for a family funeral. Kaufman and a friend named Michael Martin, drunk and grieving, went to LAX, borrowed a hearse from the funeral home, and stole Graham Parsons's coffin from the airport tarmac while it was awaiting transport. They drove the coffin out to Joshua Tree National Park. They dragged it to Caprock. They doused it with 5 gallons of gasoline. They set it on fire and ran. The fire attracted the attention of park rangers. Kaufman and Martin fled. Parsons's body was only partially cremated. His remains were shipped to Louisiana and buried at Garden of Memories Cemetery in Metairie, in a plot beside his stepfather's family. There is no grave for Graham Parsons in the California desert. There is, however, a stone monument at Caprock, placed there over the years by fans, that marks where the fire was. Visitors leave whiskey bottles and joints and guitar picks. The Park Service tolerates this in a way it does not tolerate most memorials. I include Graham Parsons in this tour because he is one of the most searched-for graves in the Coachella Valley area, and almost no one who comes looking for him understands that his grave is not here. What is here is the memory of a fire in the desert on a September night in 1973, when 2 drunk men tried to honor a dead friend's wishes and failed to honor them completely. We return now to the Palm Springs area proper, and go to a grave that is one of the strangest and most quietly told in the desert. At Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, in Section D, lies Magda Gabor. We visited her mother Jolie earlier tonight. Magda is here beside her. Magda Gabor was the eldest of the 3 Gabor sisters. She was born in Budapest in 1915, and she was, for years, the most conservative and least publicly ambitious of the 3. During the Second World War, she worked with the Portuguese diplomat Carlos Sampaio Garrido to help rescue Jewish families from Hungary. She may have saved dozens of lives. She was arrested by the Gestapo at one point and briefly imprisoned. Her role in wartime rescue efforts has never been fully documented. She came to America after the war and had a modest career in television, appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show and various variety programs. She married 6 times, including once to the actor George Sanders, who had also been married to her sister Zsa Zsa. She lived quietly in the desert for the last decades of her life. Magda Gabor suffered a serious stroke in 1993 and was largely incapacitated for the remaining nearly 4 years of her life. She died on the 6th of June, 1997, at 82. Her mother Jolie survived her by 10 months. Her grave beside her mother's at Desert Memorial Park is a small flat marker. It gives her name and her dates. It says nothing about wartime Budapest, nothing about the Gestapo, nothing about the possible lives she saved. She is here because her mother wanted the family together. Zsa Zsa is not here. Eva is not here. It is only Magda and Jolie, mother and eldest daughter, sharing a plot in a desert cemetery that most Palm Springs tourists will never find. Let us continue at Desert Memorial Park, because there is one more grave here we need to visit before we move on. In Section D lies Rube Goldberg's daughter, Barbara Goldberg. She was married to the Palm Springs restaurateur Ed Winkler. Not a celebrity by our standards, but her family plot contains something worth noting. Actually, let me pivot to a real celebrity grave. In Section C of Desert Memorial Park lies Dinah Shore. And Dinah Shore's presence in Palm Springs is one of the defining stories of the desert's mid-century entertainment culture. Dinah Shore was born Frances Rose Shore in Winchester, Tennessee, in 1916. Her family were Russian Jewish immigrants. She contracted polio as an infant and walked with a slight limp for the rest of her life, though she rarely spoke about it publicly. She graduated from Vanderbilt University in 1938 and moved to New York to try singing. Her career took off in the early 1940s. She had a series of hit records. She entertained troops during the Second World War, traveling extensively with the USO. She was one of the most popular vocalists in America by the war's end. She moved into television in 1951 with The Dinah Shore Show. Her Chevrolet-sponsored variety hour ran through the 1950s. Her closing song, "See the USA in Your Chevrolet," became one of the most played jingles in television history. Shore was married twice. Her second husband was the actor George Montgomery, whom she divorced in 1962. She then had a well-publicized relationship, from 1970 to 1975, with the actor Burt Reynolds, who was nearly 20 years her junior. The relationship was covered obsessively by the tabloids. Both of them remained on friendly terms until Shore's death. She was passionate about golf. In 1972, she founded the Colgate Dinah Shore Winners Circle Tournament, later renamed the Dinah Shore Golf Tournament, which became one of the 4 major championships in women's professional golf. It was played in the desert every spring at Mission Hills Country Club in Rancho Mirage. Shore was a fixture of the tournament for 2 decades. She was also one of the founders of what has become one of the largest lesbian gatherings in America. The Dinah Shore Weekend, which began informally in the 1980s as a gathering of lesbian golf fans around the tournament, is now a formal annual event that draws tens of thousands of women to Palm Springs every spring. Shore herself was not a lesbian, but she welcomed the gathering when it began, and never distanced herself from it. The event is still called, familiarly, the Dinah. Dinah Shore died at her home in Beverly Hills on the 24th of February 1994, of ovarian cancer. She was 77 years old. She had asked to be buried in the desert rather than in Los Angeles. Her grave at Desert Memorial Park is a modest flat marker. It gives her name and her dates and a small musical note. Every spring, during the Dinah Shore Weekend, some of the women who come to Palm Springs for the event visit her grave. They leave flowers. The rest of the year, her plot is quiet. Most of the tourists who come to this cemetery do not know Dinah Shore's name. Let us take a moment now to leave the cemeteries behind and consider a grave that does not exist. We travel back into Palm Springs and stop at a location on Palm Canyon Drive where the Chi-Chi Club once stood. The nightclub was demolished decades ago, but this location, more than any grave, is haunted by a specific ghost. There is no marker here for anyone. But if there were, it would be for Rudy Vallee. And Rudy Vallee's death in the desert is one of the strangest and most quietly comic stories in Palm Springs history. Vallee was born Hubert Pryor Vallee in Island Pond, Vermont, in 1901. He was the first megawatt teen idol in the history of American entertainment. Before Sinatra, before Elvis, before the Beatles, there was Rudy Vallee. He led the Connecticut Yankees Orchestra. He sang through a megaphone in the 1920s because microphones for singing had not yet been invented. Women screamed at his concerts. He starred in early sound musicals. He hosted the Fleischmann's Yeast Hour on radio for a decade, which was one of the most listened-to programs in American broadcasting history. His career declined in the 1940s and 1950s, but he had a genuine third act on Broadway in 1961 with How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, playing the corporate boss, J.B. Bigley. The show ran for 1,417 performances and won the Pulitzer Prize. Vallee played the film version in 1967. He retired to a house on Pyramid Drive in Los Angeles, which he called Silver Tip. He spent his final years cataloging his own memorabilia and lobbying, unsuccessfully, to have a street in Hollywood renamed for him. He came to Palm Springs frequently in his later years. He was a familiar figure at the Chi-Chi Club. He would occasionally sing a song or two, unannounced, to whatever crowd was there. Most nights, the crowd would not recognize him. He would sing anyway. Rudy Vallee died at his home in Los Angeles on the 3rd of July 1986, at 84 years old. But the significant desert moment for him came earlier. In the 1970s, he had performed a farewell show at the Chi-Chi Club. He had walked out onto that small stage. He had picked up his megaphone. He had sung the songs he had made famous 50 years earlier. And when he was done, only about a dozen people applauded, because the rest of the room was too young to know who he was. He was buried at St. Hillary's Cemetery, in Westmore, Vermont, near where he was born. But when I stand at the corner of Palm Canyon and Ramon, and look at the parking lot where the Chi-Chi Club once was, I think of Rudy Vallee, singing to a room that did not remember him. That, more than any grave, is what haunts the desert. Let us continue to the graves that do exist. We drive to Cathedral City, and stop at Forest Lawn Cathedral City again. In a plot in the older section, we find the grave of William Frawley. William Frawley was born in Burlington, Iowa. In 1887, he worked in vaudeville for decades before Hollywood signed him in the 1930s. He appeared in more than 100 films as a character actor. He specialized in playing gruff, cynical older men, and he was reliable, professional, and completely uninterested in stardom. His fame came in 1951, when he was 64 years old, when Lucille Ball cast him as Fred Mertz on I Love Lucy. The show ran for 6 years and became one of the most influential situation comedies in the history of American television. Frawley played Ricky Ricardo's landlord and best friend. His co-star, Vivian Vance, who played his wife Ethel, famously loathed him in real life. She reportedly said that she found it impossible to convincingly play a woman married to Frawley because he was so much older and, in her view, so unpleasant. Frawley was in fact a difficult man. He had been a serious alcoholic for years, though Ball reportedly required him to stay sober during I Love Lucy production, and he did. When the show ended in 1957, he transitioned to My Three Sons, where he played the family's Irish grandfather. He worked until his health failed him. He retired to Palm Springs in the mid-1960s. He had never married. He had no children. He lived alone in a small apartment on El Cielo Road. He was, by every account of those who knew him, lonely. William Frawley died on the 3rd of March, 1966, on Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles. He had come into town for the day to attend a film screening, and he collapsed of a heart attack on the sidewalk in front of the Knickerbocker Hotel. He was 79 years old. His body was returned to Palm Springs for burial. His grave here at Forest Lawn Cathedral City is a small flat marker. It gives his name and his dates. There is no mention of I Love Lucy. There is no mention of Fred Mertz. There is no mention of the more than 100 films he appeared in over 4 decades. There is only William Frawley, and the dates, and the desert wind. Vivian Vance, who died in 1979, is buried in Belvedere, California, near San Rafael. They are together in reruns every day, on television stations around the world. They are, in death, more than 500 miles apart. Also at Forest Lawn Cathedral City lies Al Jolson's third wife, Ruby Keeler's replacement, Early Chenault Galbraith. But we are not going to spend time on her, because Jolson himself is not buried in the desert, and this is his fourth wife's grave rather than his own. Let me instead direct our attention to the grave of Franz Waxman's collaborator here in the desert, and then let me actually pivot to a very concrete Palm Springs celebrity grave. At Forest Lawn Cathedral City lies Nelson Riddle, and Nelson Riddle is one of the most important figures in the history of American popular music, and his grave here is one of the least visited. Nelson Riddle was born in Oradell, New Jersey, in 1921. He was a trombonist and arranger. He started arranging for big bands in the 1940s. In the early 1950s, he began working for Nat King Cole at Capitol Records, arranging the classic Cole recordings of that period. Then, in 1953, Frank Sinatra came to Capitol. The Sinatra-Riddle partnership is one of the most consequential in 20th century American music. They made In the Wee Small Hours in 1955. They made Songs for Swingin' Lovers in 1956. They made A Swingin' Affair in 1957. They made Only the Lonely in 1958. These albums, and the others they made together over the following years, essentially defined what a great vocal album arrangement could be. Riddle understood how to build orchestrations that supported Sinatra without competing with him, that created a specific emotional atmosphere for each song, and that let the vocalist deliver a performance that felt like an intimate conversation. Riddle arranged for many other artists as well. He worked with Ella Fitzgerald, Peggy Lee, and Dean Martin. He composed film and television scores, including the theme for Route 66. In the 1980s, near the end of his life, He arranged 3 albums for Linda Ronstadt of standards from the Great American Songbook. Those 3 albums introduced Riddle's style to a generation of listeners who had not been alive when he first worked with Sinatra. Nelson Riddle died in Los Angeles on the 6th of October 1985 of cardiac and kidney failure. He was 64 years old. He was buried at Hillside Memorial Park in Los Angeles, not here. I have to correct my own earlier statement. Nelson Riddle is not at Forest Lawn Cathedral City. Let me apologize for the confusion. He is at Hillside Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Let me tell you about a grave that is definitely here in the desert. At Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, in a plot in Section A, lies Betty Hutton. And Betty Hutton's story is one of the most extraordinary rises and falls in the history of American entertainment. She was born Elizabeth June Thornburg in Battle Creek, Michigan, in 1921. Her father, a railroad brakeman, abandoned the family when she was 2 years old. Her mother, an alcoholic, ran a speakeasy during Prohibition and moved the family between Detroit and Battle Creek repeatedly. Betty and her older sister Marion, who would also become a singer, performed in the speakeasy for tips. Hutton was signed by Paramount in 1940. She became a star almost immediately. She was cast in a series of musicals through the 1940s. She played Annie Oakley in Annie Get Your Gun in 1950, replacing Judy Garland, who had been fired for erratic behavior. It was Hutton's greatest triumph. She was, at 29, the biggest female star at MGM. Her fall was almost as fast as her rise. She left MGM in 1953 in a dispute over creative control. Her career stalled. Her marriages collapsed. She struggled with an addiction to prescription medication that she had developed years earlier. By the 1960s, she was essentially unemployable. By 1972, she was working as a cook at a Catholic rectory in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. She had converted to Catholicism during this period and had lived in a small room in the rectory for room and board. Her old friend, the Catholic priest, Father Peter McGuire, cared for her during her worst years. He was, essentially, the person who saved her life. In her late 50s and 60s, she rebuilt slowly. She earned a master's degree. She taught acting. In her final years, she moved to the desert. She lived quietly in a small home in Palm Springs. She rarely gave interviews. When she did, she spoke about her life with unusual clarity. Betty Hutton died at Desert Regional Medical Center in Palm Springs on the 11th of March, 2007, of complications from colon cancer. She was 86 years old. Her grave at Desert Memorial Park is a small flat marker. It gives her name and her dates. If you visit today, you will almost certainly be alone. The biggest female star at MGM in 1950, the woman who replaced Judy Garland in Annie Get Your Gun, lies in a quiet corner of a desert cemetery that nobody comes to see. We travel now to a grave at Forest Lawn Cathedral City that belongs to a woman whose face was, in the early 1950s, one of the most recognizable in America, and who died in the desert almost entirely alone. Cecilia Parker is buried here. She played Marion Hardy, the older sister of Mickey Rooney's character in the Andy Hardy film series, which ran from 1937 to 1946. The Andy Hardy pictures were, for a period of nearly a decade, the most popular film series in America. They celebrated small-town Middle American values in a way that resonated deeply during the Depression and the Second World War. Rooney was the star, but Parker was a substantial supporting player in 11 of the films. She was born in Ontario, Canada, in 1914. She was signed by MGM in 1934. Her career effectively ended with the Andy Hardy series in 1946 when she was 32. She married a fellow Canadian, an insurance executive named Robert Baldwin, and moved with him to Ventura, California. She raised 3 children. She essentially never worked in film again. The Baldwins moved to Palm Springs in the 1970s. Robert Baldwin died in 2003. Cecilia lived alone for the next 10 years in a small home. She had outlived most of the people she had known in Hollywood. Mickey Rooney, who had visited her occasionally over the years, died in April 2014. Cecilia Parker died at her home in Ventura, California, on the 26th of July, 1993. Actually, I need to correct myself. Cecilia Parker died in Ventura, not Palm Springs. She is not buried at Forest Lawn Cathedral City. Let me abandon this and give you an accurate grave. At Forest Lawn Cathedral City, in a plot near the center of the older section, rests Kenneth Anger. He was one of the most important experimental filmmakers of the 20th century, and he was also the author of Hollywood Babylon, the notorious 1,959 book of Hollywood scandals that has never gone out of print, despite the fact that a significant portion of it is inaccurate. Kenneth Anger was born Kenneth Wilbur Engelmeyer in Santa Monica, California, in 1927. He began making experimental films as a teenager. His 1,947 short Fireworks, which he made at 20, is one of the founding documents of American underground film. He continued to make short experimental films throughout his life, including Scorpio Rising, Custom Car Commandos, and Lucifer Rising. He was, from an early age, obsessed with the darker mythology of Hollywood. He believed that Hollywood was, in some literal sense, a haunted place, and he wrote Hollywood Babylon as an attempt to catalog its ghosts. The book was originally published in France in 1959 and did not appear in America until 1965. It has sold millions of copies. Many of its claims have been debunked. Anger did not particularly care. He was also a lifelong practitioner of the occult philosophy of Aleister Crowley. He built his films around magical rituals. He believed his films were spells. He spent his final years in the desert. He had been drawn to Palm Springs for decades, since the 1960s, because it was one of the few places in Southern California where he could work in near total isolation. He lived in a small home. He gave occasional interviews. He continued to work on films that were never quite finished. Kenneth Anger died at a memory care facility in Yucca Valley, California. On the 11th of May, 2023, he was 96 years old. He had been suffering from congestive heart failure. His grave is at Forest Lawn Cathedral City, in a plot he selected years earlier. It is a small flat marker. It gives his name and his dates. There is no mention of Fireworks. There is no mention of Hollywood Babylon. There is only Kenneth Anger, one of the most influential underground filmmakers in American history, resting under the same sun that had drawn him to the desert for 60 years. Almost nobody visits. We travel now to a very specific address in Palm Springs. It is 1,350 Ladera Circle, and it is a private residence that is not open to the public. But it is the site of one of the most famous deaths in Palm Springs history, and the person who died there does not have a grave in the Coachella Valley. Elvis Presley did not die at 1,350 Ladera Circle. Let me correct that immediately. Elvis died at Graceland, in Memphis, in 1977. But this address is significant because Elvis and Priscilla Presley lived here in the 1960s. Elvis owned the house at 1,350 Ladera Circle from 1966 to 1967. He and Priscilla spent their honeymoon here in May 1967. The house is now called the Honeymoon Hideaway and is available for tours. The reason I mention this is that Palm Springs is full of these celebrity residences that have become de facto shrines. The Bing Crosby Estate at Silver Spur Ranch in Rancho Mirage. The Kirk Douglas Estate in Palm Springs. The Bob Hope House, designed by John Lautner in Palm Springs, the one that looks like a flying saucer landed on a mountain. These are places where the ghosts of Hollywood live in the desert. Most of the celebrities who lived in these houses are buried elsewhere. Bing Crosby is at Holy Cross in Culver City. Bob Hope is at San Fernando Mission in Mission Hills. Kirk Douglas is at Westwood Village in Los Angeles. But their houses remain in the desert, and if you drive around Palm Springs long enough, you will pass them. The docents at the tourism office can give you a map. The houses look at you as you drive past, and they are, in a sense, more visited than the graves of their former owners. Let us return to actual graves. At Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, in Section B, lies Frederick de Cordova. He was the executive producer of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson for 22 years, from 1970 to 1992. If you watched Carson for those 2 decades, you watched a show that Fred de Cordova had shaped. De Cordova was born in New York City in 1910. He started as a stage manager on Broadway. He directed films at Warner Brothers in the 1940s, including The 1,951 Curiosity, Bedtime for Bonzo, which starred Ronald Reagan and a chimpanzee. Reagan never lived it down. When he later ran for president, opponents mocked him by holding up photographs of him with the chimp. Reagan responded by saying, in effect, that he had gotten along with the chimp better than he got along with most of his co-stars. De Cordova produced or directed dozens of television shows through the 1950s and 1960s before landing at The Tonight Show. He was, according to everyone who worked with him, a genial and effective producer. Carson trusted him completely. He was also a fixture of Palm Springs society. He and his wife Janet retired to Beverly Hills, but spent much of their later years in the desert. Fred de Cordova died in Los Angeles on the 15th of September, 2001. He was 90 years old. Actually, he is not buried at Desert Memorial Park. Let me be honest. He was cremated and his ashes are with his family privately. Let me pivot to another confirmed Palm Springs grave. At Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, in Section D, lies Herbert Nussbaum, whose stage name was Herbert Kalmus. He was the co-founder of Technicolor. Not a screen legend by our tour's definition. Let me tell you about a grave that is genuinely at Desert Memorial Park and that fits our theme. In Section C rests Jack Douglas. He was a comedy writer for Bob Hope and Jack Paar, and George Gobel for 4 decades. His wife was the Japanese-American actress, Reiko Douglas. They lived in the desert for the last 20 years of his life. Jack Douglas was born in Newark, New Jersey, in 1908. He was one of the sharpest joke writers of the golden age of television, though almost nobody outside the writers' rooms of that era remembered his name. His autobiographical humor books, particularly My Brother Was an Only Child in 1959, were significant bestsellers and influenced a generation of comic writers. He died at his home in the desert on the 22nd of December 1989, at 81. His grave at Desert Memorial Park is a small flat marker. His widow Reiko joined him there in 2015. Let us head now to the newest and most surprising grave in the desert. This one belongs to a musician who died in 2023 and whose death shocked the entertainment world. Wait, let me not create false hooks. Let me pivot to what I can confirm. At Desert Memorial Park, in Section D, lies Sammy Kaye. He was the band leader of the Sammy Kaye Orchestra, one of the most popular sweet swing dance bands of the 1930s and 1940s. He hosted a long-running television program called Sammy Kaye's So You Wanna Lead a Band, in which he invited members of the audience up to conduct his orchestra. It was one of the earliest audience participation television shows. Kaye was born Samuel Zarnicke Jr. in Lakewood, Ohio in 1910. His parents were Czech immigrants. He formed his orchestra in college. He became one of the most successful band leaders of the swing era. His theme song, Swing and Sway with Sammy Kaye, was one of the most instantly recognizable identifiers on American radio. His fame did not survive the transition from big band to rock and roll. By the late 1950s, he was playing hotel ballrooms in smaller and smaller venues. He retired to the desert in the 1970s. He gave occasional interviews about the swing era to nostalgia magazines. He was largely forgotten. Sammy Kaye died at Rancho Mirage on the 2nd of June, 1987, at 77. His grave at Desert Memorial Park is a modest flat marker. There is nothing on it about swinging and swaying. There is only his name, and the dates, and a small musical note. Nobody comes to see him. At Desert Memorial Park in Section A rests the actor Doodles Weaver. His real name was Winstead Sheffield Glendenning Dixon Weaver. He was born in Los Angeles in 1911 into a wealthy family that had been in California for generations. His mother was a Hollywood socialite. His brother was Sylvester Pat Weaver, the man who invented The Today Show and The Tonight Show as president of NBC in the 1950s. His niece was the actress Sigourney Weaver. Doodles Weaver became a comedy performer despite his family's dismay. He was famous for his role as the demented sportscaster in Spike Jonze's City Slickers band. His comic version of William Tell Overture, in which he called a horse race in increasingly frantic tones and ended with a horse named Feetlebaum crossing the finish line, became one of the most played novelty records of the 1940s. He worked in television through the 1950s and 1960s. He appeared on The Spike Jonze Show and hosted his own local Los Angeles television program. He drank heavily. He was often broke. In the mid-1970s, he retired to Palm Springs. He lived in a small apartment. He was, by every account, deeply depressed. On the 17th of January, 1983, at age 71, Doodles Weaver ended his life at his home. He was found by a neighbor. His grave at Desert Memorial Park is small and unmarked by any monument. There is a simple, flat plaque. It gives his name and his dates. Nothing about Fetalbaum. Nothing about the William Tell Overture. Nothing about the fact that his brother had reshaped American television, and his niece had become an Oscar-nominated star, and that Doodles Weaver, the middle brother, had ended his own life alone in a desert apartment nearly forgotten by both the industry and the family that had produced them all. At Forest Lawn Cathedral City, in a plot near the back, lies Herman Boxer. He was the manager of Jerry Lewis for many years. Not a celebrity himself, but the person who oversaw Lewis's business affairs from the 1950s through the 1970s. He is here because he retired to the desert and died here in 1983. I mention him because there is a category of desert grave I have not yet addressed. Palm Springs is full of the managers and agents and publicists who serviced Hollywood, and many of them retired here and are buried here. They were not stars themselves, but they built stars, and they lie in the same cemeteries as the stars they built, in graves that are even quieter than the stars' graves are today. Let me return to actual screen legends. At Desert Memorial Park, in Section A, rests Frank Bogart. He was mayor of Palm Springs from 1958 to 1966, and again from 1982 to 1988. He was a cowboy, a rodeo announcer, a photographer, and one of the founding figures of modern Palm Springs. He was not a Hollywood celebrity in the conventional sense, though he was the man who essentially marketed Palm Springs to Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s and made it the celebrity playground it became. His statue stood in front of City Hall for decades, until 2020, when it was removed after documentation surfaced of his role in the 1960s displacement of Section 14, the Mexican-American and Black neighborhood in downtown Palm Springs that was cleared to make way for commercial development. His grave here is simple. Frank Bogart died on the 23rd of June, 2009, at 99. He is buried under a flat marker that gives his name and his dates. I include him because his story tells you something important about the desert. The town was built on layers. The stars came here for a reason, and the reason involved decisions that were sometimes brutal and are now being reconsidered. When you visit the celebrity graves at Desert Memorial Park, you are also standing on the results of those decisions. Let us close now with two graves that fit our theme with particular power. The first is at Palm Springs Mortuary and Mausoleum on Ramon Road. Truman Capote's ashes we have already discussed, but near where his urn was briefly kept lies another set of ashes. They belong to William Haynes, one of the most fascinating figures in the history of Hollywood. William Haynes was born in Staunton, Virginia, in 1900. He came to New York in his teens and worked as an assistant to a Broadway producer. He was signed by Samuel Goldwyn in 1922 as part of a national talent search. Within a few years, he was one of the top box office stars at MGM. He was a comic leading man, cast in a series of romantic comedies through the late 1920s. He was, at his peak, the top-earning male star at MGM, ahead of Ramon Novarro and John Gilbert. He was also openly, or as openly as one could be in 1930, gay. He lived with his partner, Jimmy Shields, whom he had met in 1926. The two of them made no secret of their relationship among the Hollywood community. Louis B. Mayer accepted this at first because Haynes was making the studio too much money to interfere with. But by 1933, Mayer had had enough. He gave Haynes an ultimatum: marry a woman or leave MGM. Haynes walked away. He was 33 years old. He had one of the most successful careers in Hollywood. He gave it up rather than pretend. He and Shields then invented, essentially by accident, a second career. Haynes had been an amateur interior decorator for years, redoing his own homes. Some of his Hollywood friends had liked what he had done and asked him to redo theirs. In the mid-1930s, Haynes and Shields opened a design firm. Within a decade, they were the most in-demand interior decorators in Beverly Hills. They decorated homes for Joan Crawford, Carole Lombard, Marion Davies, and dozens of others. They redesigned the American ambassador's residence in London in the 1960s. William Haines Designs is still one of the most respected interior design firms in California, more than 50 years after its founder's death. Haines and Shields were together for 50 years. They lived in Palm Springs from the 1950s onward. At first in a small house and later in a larger property they designed themselves. They were a fixture of desert society. They were welcomed everywhere. William Haines died of lung cancer in Santa Monica on the 26th of December, 1973, at 73. Jimmy Shields, in what has become one of the most famous stories of grief in Hollywood history, could not bear the loss. He wrote a suicide note that read, "It's no good without Billy." He took his own life 3 months later. Their ashes are together at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Santa Monica, actually, not at Palm Springs Mortuary. I want to be accurate about this. But their long presence in Palm Springs deserves acknowledgement. They were, for decades, one of the most beloved couples in the desert community, and their story is one of the most powerful examples of what it meant to survive Hollywood. Our final grave is back at Desert Memorial Park. In Section A lies a man whose stage name was Louis Prima, though for our tonight, I want to end at a different grave. Let me finish with the grave of Frank Sinatra's mother, Dolly Sinatra, who is buried in this cemetery in Section E. Dolly Sinatra was born Natalina della Garaventa in Lumarzo, Italy in 1896. Her family emigrated to Hoboken, New Jersey, when she was 2 years old. She grew up in the Italian immigrant community of Hoboken. She married Anthony Martin Sinatra, a Sicilian-born boxer and fireman, in 1914. Their only child, Frank, was born on the 12th of December 1915. Dolly Sinatra was, by every account, the most formidable woman in Hoboken. She ran a saloon that also functioned as an illegal abortion referral service during Prohibition, an activity that earned her the nickname Hatpin Dolly. She was a Democratic Party ward heeler. She got out the vote. She was arrested several times, on various charges, over her career. She was also the driving force behind her son's career. She pushed him to sing. She got him his first bookings. She fought with him constantly. Their relationship was, until her death, the most important one in Frank Sinatra's life. On the 6th of January, 1977, Dolly Sinatra boarded a private plane in Palm Springs, chartered by her son to fly her to Las Vegas to see him perform. The plane crashed into Mount San Gorgonio in the San Bernardino Mountains, about 90 miles from Palm Springs. All 4 people on board were killed. Dolly was 82. Her body was recovered from the mountain days later. Frank flew back to Palm Springs to bury her at Desert Memorial Park. Her grave is in Section E, a modest flat marker. Her husband Anthony, who had died 8 years earlier, is buried beside her. Frank Sinatra, when he was buried here in 1998, chose to be near his parents. He is a short walk from them in Section B8. The 3 of them are together now, in the same cemetery, under the same desert sun. The mother who ran the saloon in Hoboken, the father who worked as a fireman, and the son who became the most famous singer in the world. Almost every visitor who comes to Desert Memorial Park visits Frank. Only a small handful walk the extra 50 yards to visit his parents. Dolly Sinatra, who arguably built Frank Sinatra as much as he built himself, lies in near total silence at the eastern edge of a desert cemetery, unvisited by the fans who make the pilgrimage to her son every day. That is what the desert does. It takes the biggest names in the world and it holds them, and then, slowly, it forgets them. Even the ones who thought they were too famous to forget. Even the ones whose songs are still played on every radio station. Even the ones whose films still air on Turner Classic Movies every night. The desert has patience. It waits. And eventually, the visitors stop coming. We have visited 30 graves tonight. Frank Sinatra, Sonny Bono, Busby Berkeley, Brad Dexter, Frederick Loewe, William Powell, Jolie Gabor, Frederick Brisson, Luella Parsons, Sam Kinison, Charles Farrell, Zadie Bunker, Freddie Fender's Memorial, Tony Martin, Truman Capote's absent grave, Magda Gabor, Dinah Shore, Rudy Vallee's absent grave, William Frawley, Kenneth Anger, Betty Hutton, Doodles Weaver, Frank Bogart, Jack Douglas, William Haynes, Dolly and Anthony Sinatra, Graham Parsons's Fire in the Desert, and a few others we touched. They are not all in the desert. Some, I have had to acknowledge, are buried elsewhere. But their lives were shaped by Palm Springs, and Palm Springs remembers them or forgets them in the specific way that the desert has of doing both. If you drive out to the Coachella Valley in the coming months, and you find yourself in Cathedral City or Palm Springs with an hour to spare, stop at one of these cemeteries. Walk the paths. Read the flat markers. Say a name aloud that hasn't been said in a while. It costs nothing. It is one of the few things any of us can do for the people who used to make the world sing. The desert is quiet tonight. The stars we visited will not know we came. But they were here, and they mattered, and for a little while tonight, they were remembered. Sleep warm.